welcome to part three of our series on performance management. This session is entitled, Is Your Approach to Performance Management Stuck in the Dark Ages? Are you in a time warp? Well, you're about to find out. I'm going to share with you a short overview on the history of performance management, and that will help you understand where we're at today as an industry, but also where you might be at and where you might want to go from here. Okay, although performance management has been going on for centuries, the formal performance management actually began back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, in terms of documented performance management from a management business operations point of view. And one of the most popular folks in that era was Frederick Taylor. And Frederick Taylor wanted to find out from a more scientific perspective how the work potential for individuals would affect their productivity. So we're talking about potential, individual behavior, and productivity. And so what he did is he broke things. He wanted things to be very measured and scientific, and so he broke things down in a way that work could be split between managers and workers, and also in a way that would produce the highest level of productivity. And eventually, he broke things down so that particular activities can be done by just about anybody, and basically that's what Henry Ford adopted, which was really the beginning of the infancy of the automation line or the production line. And his goal was, anybody could do this job if we break it down into manageable pieces, that any functioning human being basically could do it. And that really, drove the success of the Ford Motor Company. So that was the early 1900s. Now, um, Taylorism actually went on to be sort of the standard bearer for measuring best output during that time. In many different parts of the world, Australia, Russia, began to adopt these kinds of management principles or employee performance principles. The second phase was Taylorism grew and other aspects began to be built on top of it. For example, more formal performance appraisal was produced, again, still focusing on worker productivity and how they could improve over time. But it didn't migrate to appraising um, someone's individual personality, their traits, for example, like knowledge and that kind of thing, instead of focusing on the accomplishment of the workplace goals and service quality. So I see a little bit of a shift there, and we'll talk about that in just the reason why. Start looking at things like punctuality, which is a behavior, and loyalty, which is an attitude, a mindset, or um, a characteristic of someone. So you'll see that certain components started to shift. The thought was if we could identify these kinds of things, it also would add to the productivity beyond just behavior itself. And then they moved to something where they started to introduce this is W.D. Scott's influence of looking at the ratings of his staff in terms of their qualities, their abilities, rating their abilities. And he also introduced man to man comparisons, which, by the way, is the introduction of what we commonly know in our era of the Jack Welch rating of A, B, and C. So they wanted to have an appraisal system that could be documented beyond just output, but now looking at qualities. They wanted to measure the performance of workers based on personality traits. Now, here's where this is the prelude to competencies, because the belief was certain traits would more likely produce desired output, and also the kind of employee they wanted. So then they went beyond productivity and output to the quality of the employee, even beyond the quality of output, productivity, and even service quality. That's really the prelude to competencies, because when we look at competencies today, our belief is, and this is, by the way, related to behavior assessments, our belief is certain behaviors or qualities will then more likely produce the outcomes that we want. And that, there's been some studies done about that, and there's some validity to that. It doesn't guarantee it, but it raises the possibility of it. So this is really the infancy of that kind of thinking. All right, and then we have the fourth phase, which is this is kind of the dark period of performance management, by the way, where they wanted to provide significant information for employees, but honestly, it kept confidential. So, I mean, anybody could say anything about anybody, and the employee didn't know about it. And this was, I hate to even say that it was like government related, but it was. It was a dominant way of which employee appraisals were adopted in the government. Uh, Very unfortunate because then even negative remarks about someone. Remember, we talked, and by the way, I hope you've seen uh, video number 2 on perception because this really feeds into a lot of understanding the history and the positive parts and the negative parts. But you have negative remarks about someone and it's in the report and they don't even know about it, and then it would affect their promotion or their career growth. Then in the 70s, they decided to make it more public, meaning they would share it with the employee in the spirit of producing corrective actions. And gradually, then performance appraisals based on inherited personality traits transformed into the valuation based on goals and objectives and for future corrective action. So that's, the evolution from the 60s, 70s, and even really the 80s. Still, though, as we're moving towards, okay, what are best practices then for performance management? Still, even with this, this is the annual performance review, but it still is delayed feedback. They missed opportunities. If you're only giving someone feedback every once in a while, you're missing opportunities for current improvement. So now that leads into, so this is the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were really about competencies, qualities, more holistic team building, working with your employees, emotional intelligence, all of the things, because the psychology of employee performance, employee behavior became embedded in our workplace. So, industrial psychology, workplace psychology, organizational psychology, all of those components then added into understanding human behavior in a more dimensional way. And then those started to infiltrate how one would be assessed for not only the performance, but also for hiring. So that's why you have a lot of assessments that you have today. And I'm going to do a segment on assessments. So that'll be down the road. But there's some value to some of them based on how they're used. They're not tests, they're assessments. And let me just give you a prelude. If you have a behavior assessment where certain behaviors or ways your brain is wired that are more natural, that fit the need of the job description, that person will have a higher probability of doing well in the job. In fact, the more natural the fit is, the less energy it will take to do the job. So I call it natural versus needed. So if you have a job description that has a lot of functions and behaviors that are needed that are a stretch for someone, it's going to take more of an effort for them to do the job. And what's the point of that? So that's where, in the recruiting industry that I was in for a number of years, we called it best fit because of their experience and how they're naturally wired and their level of satisfaction and enjoyment. Several components go into best fit. That's what we would look for when we're looking for a potential candidate for a client, where they can move into the job almost, I'm putting this in air quotes, effortlessly, so they can quote unquote hit the ground running because the job was such a natural fit for them. And you can see how what I'm just talking about was sort of, born out of formal appraisals and performance management in the history of it as we've gone through it. So what's happening now? What's happening in 2000s and beyond? Well, a lot of things are happening. Companies are seeing, and this is going back to subjective versus objective, uh, ditching annual performance reviews altogether, and seeing that there's not really that much value in them, that they're having the impact, what I suggested in both video one and video two. It's harming. It's not constructive. It's a waste of time and money, depending on how it's being done. So many are ditching it, choosing frequent feedback. They're wanting to really produce positive workplace culture. They're not really hyper focused on behaviors and qualities, but more, are they doing the job or not? Output, whatever it's being more results driven, which is kind of ideally in a way the way it's supposed to go. But anyway, then there's also the introduction of AI. We have no idea how AI will impact performance management in the future. So this is the time in our history, human resource management, employee management, where there's a big flux and there's a lot of openness. And that's why I'm doing this series, because there's a lot of openness to possibilities. We can reimagine what is performance management. What does that mean to us? And that's why we've got to ask the questions. For example, wouldn't you want to have frequent feedback for accelerated continuous improvement? Wouldn't that be logical? When I get into the introduction to the ideal aspect of performance management, I'll share a story. It's just going to, blow your mind, because uh, it's going to, we'll have to chuckle when you hear the story. But anyway, frequency of excel, frequency, frequency isn't an opportunity for accelerated feedback. And so we have to close out this session with asking again, what are you measuring? What are you assessing? And why? And then what is the real benefit to that? You notice, and we went from the first part of this history to being very uh, objective, scientific measurement. And then we moved to subjective. Notice how there was that flux back. And now, because subjective has not been particularly useful, now people have just decided just to eliminate it altogether. So this is sort of the evolution of performance management. The question is, where are you? Is your approach and your tools stuck in a time warp? Are you living in the dark ages? If you were to go back and look at that history, where is your current practices? Where are your current practices in relation to the timeline? Now, I'm leaving a link in the description, and there is a really cool infograph timeline where this information was based off of. And a really great website. They can give you some additional information as well. And that is, I want to give a shout out to them for providing this information. All right, that is part 3 in a multiple part series on performance management. I hope that you're getting a lot out of this so far. You've taken seriously the action items that I've suggested, downloaded the tools and the worksheet. Please make sure you're doing that so that you can get the most out of it that you can. All right, until next time.